Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here are your hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to the 23rd episode of Press the Button. I'm Joe Cirincione, president of Ploughshares Fund.
And I'm Michelle Dover, director of programs. We have a very full show for you today. On Early Warning, our news segment, I'm joined by Tom and Mary to discuss the risk of war in the Middle East given the recent attacks over the weekend. And after that, we will have our question and answer session where Joe gets to answer a question from one of our international listeners.
International? And you don't tell me the question in advance.
Nor the country.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. And then stay tuned for our special interview with Trita Parsi, the executive vice president of the new Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We're going to talk about not just John Bolton's sacking, but what it means, what Bolton represents in the kind of group think we have here in Washington, D.C. And then we'll have a special In the Silo segment. This is something we produce every once in a while. And this one will take you behind the scenes of the Ploughshares Fund gala chain reaction that we did this summer in San Francisco. It includes a special tribute to the founding chair of Ploughshares Board, Lew Butler.
But as you can tell, this episode is packed, so let's get to the news.
And now, Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Welcome back to Early Warning. I'm your host, Michelle Dover, and today I am joined by Tom Kalina, Director of Policy here at Ploughshares, and Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Director of Policy here at Ploughshares. Mary, Tom, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Today's theme is war and peace, and we have 7 minutes to talk about whether or not we think the U.S. is about to go to war in the Middle East. So let's get started. Over the weekend, we saw some big news, targeted attacks of Saudi Arabian oil facilities that have dramatically affected the oil markets and raised talk of war. The Houthis from Yemen are taking credit for these attacks, but the U.S. administration is started to blame Iran. Tom, what is going on? Who can we believe?
Well, thanks, Michelle. There's a lot of questions about what happened in the Gulf over the weekend, but some things are becoming clear. One, CNN is calling this possibly the biggest oil disruption in history. So bigger than what happened during the Iran Revolution in 79, bigger than the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 90. 5% of oil off the market, price is up about 10%. So this is a big deal. And the attacks may not be over. There could be additional attacks, and so there could be even further disruptions in the market. The next big question is who did it? You're right, the Houthis are taking responsibility. Many are questioning whether they had the technical ability to pull this off. The Trump administration is pointing fingers at Iran. Secretary of State Pompeo explicitly saying that he thought Iran was to blame. Intelligence sources are putting out what they claim as evidence, photographs of the attacks on the oil facilities showing that the attacks came from a certain direction, which isn't particularly indicative of anything. If these were drone attacks, drones can circle and drones can attack from any angle. So whether they came from the north or the south or whatever isn't really all that interesting or helpful in terms of deciding who's to blame. But in terms of the question of what comes next, it really does matter who's to blame, right? If this really is the Houthis, that becomes much more of a Saudi Arabian Yemen situation. If this is Iran to blame, which the Trump administration is going in the direction of, then there's the question of war. Does the United States respond with military action against Iran? Which raises some real questions. Should the United States be fighting Saudi Arabia's wars? Why are we in the business of defending Saudi Arabian oil fields? And two, there's no congressional authorization for the United States to go to war with Iran, particularly in a case where we haven't shown conclusively that Iran's to blame.
Mary, I want to actually pose Tom's question to you. Should we be going to war over this? So let's take worst case scenario, even if Iran is the one behind this, what should U.S. response be?
Well, that's a great question, and Tom's absolutely right. The U.S. shouldn't be fighting Saudi Arabia's wars. And, even if this is Iran, there's no congressional authorization for military strikes against Iran, particularly in defense of Saudi Arabia's oil fields. Now, the encouraging thing is that there are some members of Congress that are pushing back against these calls from both the administration and Iran hawks in Congress for military action. Lindsey Graham in particular has been very vocal about this. Even before there was the question of whether Iran was responsible instead of the Houthis, Lindsey Graham was out there tweeting, "This is why we need to bomb Iran," essentially. Now, fortunately, some congressional Democrats have been pushing back against this push for war from the administration. Tim Kaine, Chris Murphy, Ro Khanna, they've been very clearly pointing out and pushing back and saying there's no authorization for war. If the administration wants to undertake military strikes, they have to present clear, credible evidence, which they've failed to do, and they need to come to Congress for authorization.
Well, and it's also, what military strike would actually lead to anything other than a massive conflict in the Middle East that the U.S. would then have to invest troops and treasure at a scale that we just haven't seen. I mean, I also just don't see what a credible plan would be to respond militarily.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine what the Trump administration might think would be a proportional response of, for example, attacking a Iranian oil field, for example. But of course, we have no idea where that goes, right? Escalation could go out of control from there, and we could be looking at a ground invasion or massive war.
So Mary, we had talked about this where, Bolton is gone, and I was at least like, yay, this is
we were all really excited.
Risk. But you've made the excellent point that there is still this risk for war. How is this possible?
Well, yeah. So look, we were all really excited with Bolton gone. The immediate reaction was this is an opportunity for diplomacy because Bolton has been advocating for war with Iran for years. But what we're seeing now is that the result of the administration's maximum pressure campaign, this was not just about Bolton, this is an entire campaign backed by many members of the Trump administration. And the result of that campaign is that it set us on the track for war, and we're potentially moving toward a military conflict. We could be drawn into a military conflict, even without Bolton pushing it, because the maximum pressure campaign has created those conditions.
So what is then the chance of a potential meeting between Trump and Rouhani at the upcoming UN General Assembly? I'm assuming it's pretty low.
Right. It's certainly still possible. Trump could do another 180 before the UN General Assembly, which is next week in New York. Trump will be speaking on a Tuesday. Rouhani follows him. So there's still a chance for them to meet and shake hands. And who knows, maybe this will all de-escalate before then. It seems very unlikely. Trump's already contradicted himself. He's previously said very clearly on the record in front of cameras that he's willing to meet with Rouhani without preconditions. He's now contradicted himself and said that was fake news. He never said that at all. So it does seem unlikely. Trump seems much less willing to meet with Rouhani.
Tom, any final thoughts?
Well, I would just say on this question of Bolton, he's gone. Why are we still on the brink of war? I would just say that, Bolton seemed like the most hawkish person in the administration, and maybe he was, but certainly he was just hiding the fact that there's a lot of hawkish people in this administration. And Pompeo is showing that he's a pretty close second by coming out so quickly accusing Iran of being the perpetrator in this attack. So this administration is still leaning towards war, and that's maybe where we're going.
Well, with that, our time is up. Thank you, Mary and Tom, for joining me.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Letters, we get stacks and stacks of
Another week, another question.
I love this segment.
Are you ready for this, Joe?
I am. Let's go.
So today's question comes from Ben in Scotland. And Ben wants to know what your thoughts are about Britain and France's nuclear forces. Does it make sense for these countries to retain independent nuclear forces?
No, but I'll tell you why in just a second. What's the second part?
That politicians in the UK who are opposed to unilateral disarmament often argue the UK should pursue a multilateral approach to nuclear disarmament instead. And what could the UK do towards fostering that multilateral nuclear disarmament?
Good question, Ben. Thank you. Well, the United Kingdom, of course, helped the United States develop the nuclear bomb in the Manhattan Project. But the United States was against the United Kingdom getting the bomb. The United States has never backed another country getting the bomb, even our allies, even Great Britain, even France, even Israel. We've always thought that the spread of these weapons was dangerous to international stability. The UK exploded their test bomb in 1950. About a few months after the Soviet Union tested theirs. Did they need to do it? No, they did not. And they did it for prestige. There's three main reasons countries get nuclear weapons: security, prestige, and domestic politics. And in this case, Great Britain was trying to hang on to the vestige of its collapsing empire and thought it needed nuclear weapons. Well, once Great Britain got one, you can imagine what Charles de Gaulle thought, and he immediately revved up his program, and the French then tested about a decade later. Did they need it? No, they don't need it. The United States, whether you approve or disapprove the nuclear umbrella concept, the United States, as a NATO ally, as a military ally of Great Britain and France, has the kind of defensive capability, security guarantees that any country would need. There's no need for a third European nuclear force, a fourth European nuclear force. Now, France and Great Britain, it was all a matter of prestige, wanting a seat at the table. And guess what? In international politics, they were right. Why is Great Britain, United Kingdom, a member of the UN Security Council, a permanent member?
Because they have the bomb.
And France, why are they on the UN Security Council?
Ditto.
Exactly. So why does India detonate a nuclear bomb in 98? Because it thinks that it should be at the table, and so you got to be nuclear to be there. So it is essential that we start to decouple nuclear weapons from this kind of international prestige. So please, Great Britain, get rid of this redundant, expensive, unnecessary UK nuclear arsenal.
Thanks, Joe. As always, please send your question to press the button, that is one word, press the button, at ploughshares.org.
I'm Joe Cirincione, and we're here in the Glass Enclosed headquarters of Ploughshares Fund in D.C., and I'm delighted to be here with Trita Parsi. Trita, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Trita is the Executive Vice President of the new Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that towards the end of this interview. But I want to start off by telling you, it's 9 o'clock on a Friday morning, Trita. I don't usually come in at 9 o'clock. For you, I'm coming in at 9 o'clock.
I appreciate it, Joe.
You're a busy man. You have a lot to do. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about John Bolton, but not just about John Bolton. We're going to assess the damage he did, what he represents, what those policies represent, and how they're not as extreme as you might think in Washington, D.C., and that will get us to why you started this new research institute, the Quincy Institute. So give us a brief overview before we get started of who you are. How did you get started in this town?
I got started in this town back in 2001 when I came here to do my PhD at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I was actually...
Nice drop. Very nice.
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
I was actually...
Dr. Trita Parsi.
August 2001, I was going to do my PhD on Afghanistan. 2 weeks later, 9/11 happens. And overnight, everyone in this town become Afghan experts.
Wow.
And I felt like, well, that market is saturated, so I needed to focus on something else. And I thought, what's the next likely big conflict? And I thought Iran and Israel. Mm-hmm. And no one had done any work on that, so I wrote my dissertation on that.
Which became your
first book, Treacherous Alliance. Yeah.
I loved that book. I recommend it to everybody. The complicated relationship between Israel and Iran. People don't understand how close Israel and Iran were under the Ayatollah. Under
Even
the
under
Ayatollah.
the Ayatollah for a while, exactly.
Yeah. So, but that was great. And then,
But that kind of gave me the start here, and I was heading NIAC, the National Iranian-American Council, for about 17 years. And last year, I handed over the baton to Jamal Abdi, who's been doing an excellent job running NIAC ever since, and I moved over to Quincy.
Full disclosure, we are longtime supporters of NIAC. Ploughshares Fund gives out grants. We raise money from generous contributors, like hopefully the people listening to this podcast, and we find the best people with the smartest ideas, and you, Trita, are certainly one of those people.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to have supported NIAC, and we are an early investor in the Quincy Institute.
You are, and we're very grateful for that.
Now that we know who you are and how you got started, give us your assessment of John Bolton's departure and his rocky 17-month tenure.
Well, I think I could hopefully recreate the scream of joy I had when I saw the tweet that he had been fired. I mean, it's not often that you see a tweet from Donald Trump and you're happy about it, but this one definitely was the case. And the immediate reason was because I felt that this significantly reduces the likelihood of a war between the United States and Iran. Not that it has been eliminated in any way, shape, or form, but that immediacy, I think, is somewhat gone. But also because it opened up some space for diplomacy that hopefully can be captured. But Bolton's damage to the United States national security, I call him the saboteur-in-chief of diplomacy. Whichever administration he has served to undermine and prevent diplomatic resolutions in favor of the use of force. Bolton's attitude to the world is that he believes that all of these institutions and international laws are all constraints aimed at constraining American power. You get rid of those and you have the law of the jungle, where the law of the jungle benefits the biggest predator in the jungle, and that is the United States because of its military size. It's an extremely raw and rather primitive view of power and what power can do that he has. I think some who point out that he's actually not so much a neoconservative as much as he's just a simply neo-imperialist may have a point, because Bolton doesn't even pretend to want to promote democracy and things like that other neocons tend to at least shield some of their views behind. He doesn't even bother.
That's right. So the neoconservatives are, to me, people who say they want to promote U.S. democracy abroad. They want to do it on the point of Marines' bayonets, however.
Yeah.
But for him, it's not at all clear that he cares that much what replaces the regimes that he's toppling, as long as the U.S. benefits from the toppling.
Yeah, I mean, take a look at what he said about the Iraq War. I think on one show, on Tucker's show on Fox, he was defending it, and he was saying that it was a great success. And if you just put yourself in his mindset for a second, I think you can understand why he says it was a success. Because the toppling of Saddam, the destruction of that country, essentially removed Iraq from the geostrategic chessboard. Iraq no longer has the capacity to pose a threat to the United States or to any U.S. allies, a good ally or bad ally, doesn't matter. Now, whatever follows afterwards is an afterthought.
Right.
It's not of any relevance to John Bolton.
Right. There was even this theory that he was part of this a theory of creative chaos.
Yes.
That it was okay if there was chaos afterwards. One of the reasons there wasn't a lot of planning for the occupation was that they didn't really care. They just wanted the bases. And so then
and this, incidentally, I think is part of the reason why he, for more than 20 years, has been supportive of one of the most anti-democratic, cultish organizations, the Iranian Mujahideen Khalq terrorist organization.
Yes.
If you truly believe in democracy, then you certainly wouldn't be supporting a group like that.
The MEK,
the
a group
MEK.
that the U.S. labeled a terrorist organization.
For quite some time. But if your objective is just to make sure that you rearrange the geopolitical chessboard in the Middle East and get rid of Iran as a potential foe,
right,
then the MEK is perfect.
Right. It's like back in the Nazi Party because it helped you get rid of the Weimar Republic.
Yeah, exactly.
You just didn't care. Right. And so
in some ways, he's almost more honest than some of the other neocons who actually have that democratic pretense.
And this is one of his appeals to the right, and it's one of the clarifying things about him and helping us understand this ideology. Back in 2003, when the Iraq War appeared to be going well, he was asked what lesson Iran and North Korea should take from the Iraq War, and he said, take a number. And this was the plan. Iraq was the beginning, right? They were all going to topple one by one.
And his second stint now in the Trump administration was to finish the job.
Okay, so let's talk about this, and then we'll go deeper. One of the things I always tell my students, I teach a seminar at Georgetown, is that one of the great things about national security policy is that it leaves a track record. You can go back and look. You can debate these things while they're happening. Here's pro, con, here's your, crossfire, here's your panel at the university. But when you're in office, you get a chance to do it. And John Bolton implemented his ideology for 17 months. How did he do?
Well, just take a look at the state of the world right now. Even take a look at it from the perspective of Trump. Trump, at the end of the day, does seem to have some sort of a desire for a diplomatic success.
Yes.
Now, his definition of diplomatic success seems to center around photo ops and not necessarily national strategic objectives. But nevertheless, did he even get that? Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, as long as Bolton was there, he was making sure that there wasn't much movement in terms of diplomacy, because the more positive movement you have in terms of diplomacy, the less the risk of war is. He himself apparently told friends that he was devastated when Trump chose not to bomb Iran.
Yes.
Devastated. I mean, that's a very interesting choice of word that tells you something about where the true desires of this man was, and it was always in the direction of war.
Yes, he came close. He came close. He's been campaigning for war with Iran for over 2 decades. He promised I think it was at an MEK rally in July of 2017, he promised them that we would celebrate in Tehran in 2019, that the regime change had to become the policy of Donald Trump's administration. Yeah. Didn't work. And he was so close. He 10 minutes, according to Donald Trump, before Trump pulled back the strikes. Destruction interruptus.
And now, and he came in, I think, to a certain extent because Trump was so driven by his desire to get rid of the Iran deal, mainly because of his own problems in his mind with Obama. And almost everyone that he had gotten around himself, the adults in the room, as they were called, may not have been fans of the deal, but they were not in favor of getting rid of it. Once he got rid of all of those people,
yes,
and he got people that actually would facilitate.
Rex Tillerson, Jim Mattis, Dan Coates, right? All the national security advisors, we should emphasize this. The entire national security apparatus under Donald Trump was in favor of staying in the Iran deal. All our allies were in favor of staying in the Iran deal. They begged him not to do it. Bolton.
And this really upset Trump. So he wanted to get people that actually would facilitate getting out of the deal. It just so happens to be that if you get someone who actually wants to get out of the deal, chances are quite high that that person also wants to have war with Iran.
Yes.
And then he ended up surrounding himself with people who was pushing for this maximum pressure strategy, knew how to implement it, whereas the other ones were very lackluster about their desire to implement it. But they were doing so not for the sake of a future negotiation, they were doing so for the sake of a military confrontation.
Yes. And so here is where the story gets interesting, because Bolton's not unique, right? When he was in the room ordering the strikes, he had the Secretary of State, who also was in favor of the strikes. He had the new director of the CIA, and she was also in favor of the strikes. So Bolton is an extreme element in the national security debate, but he is connected to the body politic, the way these institutions think about force and think about U.S. role in the world. And I got that from you, so why don't you explain this?
Yeah, I mean, clearly he's connected to Pompeo and some of these other individuals, and even though Pompeo right now seems to want to distance himself from Bolton, when push came to shove, as you pointed out, and he had to give counsel to the president, do you bomb or do you not bomb? He was on the same side as Bolton. But I think what you're pointing to is not just the similarities that exist between Bolton and other hawks, such as Pompeo, but the fact that at the end of the day, the grand strategy of the United States, the framework for our foreign policy that has been in place, at least for the last quarter century,
under Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives.
Exactly. Produce people like Bolton.
Yes.
At the end of the day, he is a more extreme version of it. But the distance between him and some others are not as great that they may appear, particularly if we are willing to entertain other approaches to foreign policy within this narrow spectrum of opinion, then perhaps it does look as if there's some distance. But if you actually broaden the conversation, you do see that there's a tremendous amount of similarities.
What do you mean?
Well, let me put it this way. Whether you are on the neoconservative side, very hawkish, or on the liberal interventionist side, all of these foreign policy approaches emerge out of some of the same ideas. They have several of their first principles that are completely identical. Both of them believe that the United States should militarily dominate the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the liberals call it liberal hegemony, but it is hegemony at the end of the day. Now, Bolton may not be very favorable towards the use of the word liberal, but he's definitely signing up for the hegemony part. But the belief that we actually
let's
have
get the
to...
hegemony, and then we can argue what the character is.
Exactly. The belief, nevertheless, is that the United States needs to dominate almost every corner of the world.
That's one.
There is a very strong belief, and this is perhaps even stronger at times on the Democratic side, that the United States is, by definition, the answer to almost every problem in the world.
Yes.
A bit of that American exceptionalism. And I personally believe that the United States has a tremendous amount to contribute, but the belief that we have to lead does not mean that we have to dominate, nor does it mean that we have to push out everyone else and prevent them from being able to step up with their own solutions. We should be very grateful if other countries, particularly in regions that they know that we don't, step up and want to provide solutions and want to provide security for those regions, rather than believing that the United States constantly has to dominate every part of the world and that we, by definition, are some form of a solution to every problem there is out there. This is very much part of the reason why you also find it very much on the Democratic side, the belief that we have to be everywhere to fix things.
Yes.
Even when we actually have no knowledge about those places. And, you know, again, I think we have to decouple the idea that American leadership is the same thing as American military hegemony.
Yes.
We can have American leadership. We can be tremendously supportive. We can model our behavior in such a way that others wants to model it according to ours by being an inspiration. That does not mean that we need to militarily dominate every region. In fact, our military domination and our military adventurism has undermined our global leadership.
Yes. And this also translates into real money. It's not just a point of view. It's not just an op-ed. It's not just a speech. It's a $738 billion military budget that's about to go through Congress, nearly unanimously, right?
Yeah.
So again, everybody, since you were a student, since 9/11 and the military budget started going back up again, it's been supported.
It's been supported
by
by
everyone,
both sides.
by
Exactly.
vast, big majorities.
Yeah. And those who are questioning it, when you scratch the surface, you will see that they are not only questioning it because of those numbers, but because they are also questioning the first principles of our foreign policy. They want to see a different approach, an approach that is more different in a deep sense rather than just being marginal in some of its changes. And I think, again, to just look at the track record, as you pointed out, we have a track record to review. Yes, if you have a Republican administration with a lot of neoconservatives, you can end up getting Iraq. But if you have a Democratic administration with no neoconservatives in the government, you can still end up getting a Libya. And that intervention is as disastrous as that of Iraq. Perhaps it was done with better intentions, but intentions at the end of the day are nice.
Yes,
but
they're a factor. That's right. They're a factor in the
factor.
equation as you judge what happened. But the results was chaos.
You have slave markets in Libya right now. That is in no way, shape, or form a justification or a defense of Gaddafi or of Saddam. But it shows you that it's not just neoconservatism that leads to these type of military adventures and interventions.
In fact, I've been concerned by some of the commentary I've seen from liberals about Bolton. They are so they're in such a rush to criticize Trump that they end up backing Bolton. They say things like, "Well, at least he had a worldview. He was a rational actor. They see him as a source of stability against the increasingly erratic Donald Trump." And they mourn his loss.
It's just stunning and shocking. And I know some have gone a little bit further in saying things like that. I personally thought it was unfortunate. I think Senator Chris Murphy is a fantastic senator. He did an amazing job on the Iran deal. He's been an absolute leader when it comes to ending the war in Yemen and putting some spotlights on our rather problematic relationship with Saudi Arabia. But he had a tweet in which he said that if we have this meeting between Trump and Rouhani, it will only end up legitimizing dictators. And it goes back to those first principles in which there's an agreement between some of the liberal interventionists and the neoconservatives, in which they view the United States as some sort of a universal source of legitimacy in the international system.
Right, so merely meeting with a foreign leader.
We are just radiating legitimacy. We're that exceptional and that awesome. And it's nice to perhaps think that way of oneself, but reality tells us that we should be a little bit more humble. And we should recognize that that type of thinking actually raises the bar for diplomacy and lowers the bar for military action. And that's highly problematic.
Well, you know, I've seen this in the criticism of Bolton. There have been a lot of people who have said, well, you know, at least he kept us from a bad deal with North Korea, which is true. He sabotaged the deal with North Korea that was on the table at the Hanoi summit. And there's a lot of my liberal friends, believe, well, that was a bad deal. We shouldn't have taken it. And look at what we have instead. Or the same with Iran, that, you know, he was a source of toughness towards Iran that was necessary in order to get Iran back in the deal that we violated.
Yeah, we did not need to get them back into the deal because they were in the deal. We're the ones that are outside of the deal.
Yes.
So the very idea that this is needed to get them back in the deal is, again, part of that blindness of our own actions.
And this is a point of view that permeates the Washington think tanks. While you were studying at SAIS, I was working over across the street at the Carnegie Endowment. And there's always been a lot of problems and a lot of questions about the think tank culture in this town. But while I was there, these were fairly modest, small forums for academic debate. And when Heritage and AEI came to town with lots and lots of conservative money, Brookings and Carnegie and CSIS felt challenged, and they all went on an expansion phase. And they've since at least doubled in size. I mean, CSIS was an academic institute at Georgetown when I was a student there. Now it's the Hyatt Hotel.
Yeah. Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, and how did they get there? How did they grow? Well, corporate money, government money, not just foundation money and philanthropists, but an enormous influx of new money. And part of what that's meant is that the debates have become so skewed. The reports that they do, the interest that they have, whether you're Center for a New American Security or Center for American Progress, I mean, even the most liberal of the think tanks tend to skew towards corporatism, towards moderation, towards support of this worldview.
Yeah, think tanks were supposed to be, as you said, vibrant places where a lot of thinking would take place, but increasingly they're the gardeners of the status quo, and almost suppressing the debate in at least attempts to question some of the more profound premises of our foreign policy. And I think that's part of the reason why American foreign policy right now is suffering from a conceptual deficit. And it's the job of the think tanks to be able to resolve that, and I don't think most of them have done a particularly good job at that. Having said that, there are a tremendous amount of good people in many of these places that are doing an excellent job, but as a whole, that industry, I think, has fallen short of what it should do. The other thing that is also added to this is, of course, that the revolving door has become almost a straitjacket, in the sense that many folks in the think tanks are so adamant about getting the next job, which instead of then allowing themselves to think freely while they're out of government and think out of the box, the thinking has increasingly become, what are the kind of things that can get me a job in the next administration? So instead of then providing with that more creative input, it just becomes something that dovetails what already is taking place.
And while they're writing their report, they're thinking about how this will play at the confirmation table at the hearing. Yes, I know. So what's your answer?
Well, this is part of the reason why we created the Quincy Institute, which on its very premises are questioning some of the first principles of American foreign policy, believe that we need to have a different framework, a different paradigm of how we approach things, which we call responsible statecraft. It's evolved out of what in academia is called restraint, a belief that the United States should not dominate militarily every region in the world. We do not need 850 bases around the world. We should have a much higher bar for when the United States takes military action. It should lead, but it should not lead by militarily dominating every place. It should work in partnership with other countries. We really need to make sure that it's not just that diplomacy needs to come back at the center of American statecraft. Our mindset needs to shift. Let me give you an example. There was a tremendous amount of mayhem when Trump earlier this year, was it December of last year, announced that he wanted to remove troops from Syria. 2,000 troops in Syria. Hardly anyone knew exactly what they were doing there, what the mission was. And you had people throwing tantrums on TV, people that the week before had complained about our endless wars.
Yes.
But now suddenly we're devastated that 2,000 troops were going to be withdrawn. You had Mattis resign. You had other people resign from government. I was stunned, not by that reaction, but the absence of reaction when the United States, under Trump, pulled out of the Geneva process, which was a diplomatic process aimed at finding a solution to the problem in Syria that had brought together almost all of the countries that were involved. The US pulled out, and that process ended up becoming the Astana process, led by Russia, Turkey, and Iran. We abandoned diplomacy. No one threw a tantrum on TV, and no one resigned. Because our paradigm of foreign policy has become such that the only measure of our influence is military power. So we completely neglect, we don't even see or appreciate what the United States can do diplomatically. And it's not just an issue of war and diplomacy, it's an issue of how we see the world and how we fit into it, in which I think we have militarized not only our foreign policy, but our mindset about how to engage with the rest of the world.
So what will the Quincy Institute stand for?
As I mentioned, we're standing for an American leadership that is an American foreign policy that is centered on diplomacy.
Right, so you are not advocating withdrawal from the world. You're not talking about unilateral disarmament or abandonment of American principles.
No, and I think it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because there's these accusations of isolationism that has come out, which is quite preposterous, but it's also reflective of the idea that if you say that you want to have less military bases and you don't want to dominate every corner of the world militarily, that means isolationism. Because engagement with the world is to bomb other countries. No, we strongly reject that. We would definitely reduce America's military footprint because it is not sustainable, it is not contributing to stability, it is a cause of a lot of problems that we have at home and a lot of neglect that is taking place at home. But we would be fully engaged diplomatically and lead diplomatically, but also lead by supporting others to lead, instead of thinking that the United States has to be the answer in and of itself to every problem in the world.
Well, I for one, welcome your entrance into the think tank world, and I can't wait to have it happen. Where does the process stand?
We're launching
when will you open your doors?
Launching end of November, and we'll come out with 1 or 2 reports within the first month that we hope will bring in some new, fresh thinking. And I think we're at a moment, particularly with the elections and potentially with a new administration coming in 2021, if that happens, in which we have a moment where we really need to rethink things. Because if it's just going to be a return to how things were before, then we're fooling ourselves. Because I don't think Trump, just as much as Bolton, was something that dropped from the sky and originated in Jupiter. It's something that was born out of what we already have and what we already did. And I think it's a moment now for us to rethink this and start doing something else, so that we don't end up fluctuating between Iraq war disasters and Libya war interventions.
And who's in the leadership of the organization?
It's
You're the executive vice president.
Suzanne DiMaggio is the chairperson.
She's been on the podcast. She's wonderful.
Andrew Bacevich is the current president.
I will get him on the podcast.
You absolutely should. Stephen Wertheim is heading the Endless War program. Eli Clifton is involved in one of the founders, one of the first people involved. And we are hiring right now. We're hiring quite a few people right now. So if people are interested, they should go to quincyinst.org and apply.
Quincy with a C, as in John Quincy Adams.
Exactly.
And he's your sort of philosophical inspiration, because
he gave a fantastic speech in 1821 in which he said that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And it was a call against interventionism, But there was also a latter part of that paragraph that I think was very important, because he points out that if the United States were to do so, yes, perhaps she would become the ruler of the world, but it would come at the expense of her own freedom and spirit. And I think after 9/11, we have definitely seen that happening. And he warned us about it 200 years ago.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Trita. Thanks for coming on.
For this episode, we go back in the silo, where Senior Development Officer Bonnie Fisk shares highlights about our annual Chain Reaction event, Ploughshares Fund's most successful fundraising gala to date. Bonnie also reflects on a pivotal moment in our foundation's history, honoring Lew Butler, who was in the living room where Ploughshares Fund came to life back in 1981.
My name is Bonnie Fisk. I'm Senior Development Officer at Ploughshares Fund. I oversaw the fundraising for Chain Reaction. It is our annual gala fundraiser to secure new and additional funds for our grant making. The theme was a new moment that was derived of opportunities for changing nuclear policy for the better. We held a Chain Reaction at SF Jazz Center here in San Francisco. As you entered the building, we had the Ploughshares Fund logo dropped down, and it was covered with an unimaginable amount of greenery, and that was supposed to sort of signify the oxygen and freshness and the newness of the moment that we're seeing and what we were going to talk about that evening. We decided to start with a cold open. Nuclear historian Alex Wellerstein just walked on the stage for what we think is a necessary reality check.
We never woke up. We never dismantled the machine. We put it to the back of our minds. We stopped talking about it. We stopped worrying about it, but it was still there the whole time. And now we live in a world with thousands of nuclear weapons, and the proliferation question, and the terrorism question, and new weapon systems.
Our keynote speaker was Beatrice Finn. She's the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and she joined us from abroad. This was her San Francisco debut after having given the Nobel laureate speech in Oslo in 2017. ICANN was actually the Nobel Peace Prize winner that year.
So by talking about these humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and what these weapons do to people when used, ICANN has managed to reframe the debate. When we recognize that these weapons are weapons of mass destruction, built for mass murdering civilians, for violating the laws of war, and to cause catastrophic humanitarian harm, it is really difficult to draw other conclusions than these weapons must be illegal.
A highlight of the evening was that we had a last-minute surprise guest, Governor Jerry Brown. He called Joe over the weekend, and he had heard tell that we were having this event coming up on that Monday, and he said, I would like to come, and I would like to say a few words.
When Trump came out here for the fire up there in Paradise, what he called pleasure.
What a name.
That was strange. I was standing right next to him, and I decided I didn't think it was my place to correct him. But in any event, we rode on a helicopter from Beale Air Force Base, which I drove to from Sacramento. It's right outside Yuba City. And we were getting into a helicopter, and we were going up to Paradise. And the first guy, I was standing there waiting to get in. Gavin Newsom was there. And a guy with a kind of a old satchel went first. And I presume that was the football. And he got in, and he sat in the seat, and then I got in and sat in the seat right in front of him. Then Jared, the son-in-law, gets in, then Newsom, then General Kelly, and then Trump. So Trump was right in front of me. The guy with the satchel's behind me. I figured, well, I can stop nuclear war.
We concluded the evening with a very special, touching moment where one of our board members, Rachel Pike, honored the years of service of our founding board chair, Lew Butler. Rachel is the granddaughter of Ploughshares Fund's founder, Sally Lilienthal. Rachel told the inspiring story about the relationship between her grandmother and Lew when they were starting this whole vision of what Ploughshares Fund was going to be.
Lew was really my grandmother's counterpart. She was visionary, strong and funny and sharp. And Lew was bedrock, gritty and balanced and fair. And he was there at that first meeting in my grandmother's living room in 1981.
I have one memory, And that's sitting on Sally Lilienthal's couch in 1981 in the living room. And there's this very nice gentleman next to me, Owen Chamberlain, who Sally nudges me and says he's got a Nobel Prize in physics. And don't make a fool out of yourself. And we all said a bunch of profound things that were easily forgettable. And then very quietly, Owen says, there's only one problem that can mean the end of civilization. That's nuclear weapons.
And there was a pause. And Ploughshares was born right then. And Lew immediately became chair of the board. Lew was there when Ploughshares got its first tiny office in Fort Mason. He was there when Ploughshares gave our until then biggest grant to National Resources Defense Council to install monitoring equipment in the ground to look for seismic activity, which is the result of test explosions underground in both Nevada and Russia. So we want to give you a globe.
As part of the tribute, Rachel presented Lew with a crystal globe that was engraved with a quote from Sally. And it said,
"In this uncertain world, it is essential that we be unafraid to take chances on a person with a good idea."
So now we have Ploughshares, 40 years later. It's better now than it's ever been. Thank you for supporting it. Governor, thank you for your cheerleading. And off we go to a better world.
Thank you to everyone who came and made this the most successful chain reaction to date. If you weren't there and you're inspired to get involved, visit ploughshares.org for more information.
To hear Joe Cirincione's complete in-depth conversations with Alex Wellerstein and Beatrice Finn from previous podcast episodes, visit ploughshares.org/press the button. Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.